I'm Nate Tolliver, and I co-directed this film with Zach Fazio. If you haven't seen part 1, check that out first. But for now, enjoy part 2.
After 2 years of attending that church in Toronto, my double life had exhausted me. And by that time, I'd had sex hundreds of times with different guys. One day, one of the ministers who had studied the Bible with me noticed that I wasn't doing well, so he invited me over to his home to see how he could help. How could I tell him of all the things I was involved in? I knew that if I were to follow what the Bible taught on sexual morality, that meant that I could never romantically be with another man again. As we talked, I knew I couldn't continue living both lives. I had to pick one and then move on with my life. I remember leaving that minister's home, choosing homosexuality over Jesus. I had finally made my choice. That was it. There was no going back. I went out to the street and got on the next city bus to take me home to begin the rest of my life as a gay man. That was a 20-minute bus ride that changed my life forever. The thought that kept running over and over in my mind was, Guy, you know that Jesus died for you. How could you turn your back on that? And the more I thought about it, I knew I couldn't live the rest of my life knowing that I'd turned my back on a man who was willing to die for me. That night, I read my Bible, I prayed, and I cried more than I had ever cried before. My heart was broken, and I was finally surrendered. I knew I wanted Jesus more than anything else, and I was ready to sacrifice whatever I needed to in order to follow him. I knew it would be the struggle of a lifetime, but I was finally willing to do it. Besides, following Jesus provided forgiveness and heaven, two pretty good fringe benefits of the plan, things homosexuality could never deliver. The next day I returned to that minister's home, and I got completely transparent with him. He was so compassionate and understanding and believed that I could change. And over the next few weeks, I learned more than ever before that Jesus was not only willing to forgive me, but also set me free. On August 15th, 1987, I became a Christian. And while my attractions to men didn't change, my heart and actions certainly did. And I had finally found God, and the hole that was in my heart was filled. Little did I know that God was preparing me to find even more in life. And I was baptized on August 15th, 1987, and I can tell you that I have not participated in any kind of homosexual activity since my conversion. What God wants us to do is to strive to live holy lives and glorify and honor him with our lives, and that's what I'm striving to do every day, and I just trust and believe that God's grace is sufficient. Okay, what we're going to be talking about next is just going over some of the basics on dealing with the issue of homosexuality, and let's start here. I'd like to be able to talk a little bit about terminology. Words are important, terminology is important, and what I say may not be the same thing that you would say, and we may not understand each other. So let's start with this. What is the difference between people who say that they're gay and homosexual versus people who say that they're same-sex attracted? Well, people who are gay and homosexual are people who use that term to be able to describe themselves. It's an identity marker to them, and most often homosexuality is not a moral issue to them. So it's something that they celebrate, it's something that they want people to know about, and they identify themselves as somebody who is homosexually attracted. Then there's people who are same-sex attracted. I never use the term homosexuality or gay to describe myself because I don't want to infer something that isn't real. You see, because I do not celebrate my same-sex attractions. This is not something that I identify myself with. Jesus is my identity. He's the one I've decided to follow, and I don't want to be known as a person who is homosexually attracted. There's so much more to my life than that. And so I don't use those terms to describe myself. I don't celebrate homosexuality, I don't participate in homosexuality, and I haven't now for 28 years. But I have to use some kind of terminology to be able to describe who I am, and so for that purpose, I say that I'm same-sex or I'm same-gender attracted. So, let's talk a little bit about what the Bible actually teaches about homosexuality. You know, it really doesn't talk about it that much. We really only get 5 scriptures. You'd think on an issue this significant and important, we would get more passages than this, but we don't. We only get 5. There are a few other scriptures, mentioned throughout the Bible, for instance, on Sodom and Gomorrah and whatnot, but these are the main 5. And even though we only get 5, there's a lot we can learn from them. But let's read one of them. Here's what it says. Don't you realize that those who do wrong will not inherit the kingdom of God? Don't fool yourselves. Those who indulge in sexual sin or who worship idols or commit adultery or are male prostitutes or practice homosexuality. There's a lot of things in there. Homosexuality just being one of them. None of these people will inherit the kingdom of God. That's a long list, isn't it? So we can see that the Bible clearly states that homosexuality is not a part of God's plan for human sexuality. Now, that's not a real popular message today, but it's significant that these 5 scriptures are written in both the Old and the New Testaments. It's important to recognize that these 5 scriptures are written years apart by different authors to different audiences and different cultures. See, a lot of times people will say, oh, God, that was written thousands of years ago. Are you kidding? That can't apply to 2016. Yet in reality, it does, because these scriptures were written thousands of years apart. A lot of times people will say, well, maybe it's a cultural thing. But you see, no, because these scriptures that were written to different cultures and different audiences. So it is true, actually, from Genesis to Revelation, that God makes it clear that when it comes to human sexuality, his desire is that it be reserved between that of a man and a woman bound together only in marriage. And not one time is homosexuality talked about in a positive light as something that should be emulated. Now, as I said, that's not a very popular message today. I don't know if it ever will be, but that is the biblical sexual ethic, and certainly that is the stance that I take in my own personal life. It's what I understand the scriptures to teach.
When I became a Christian, my whole life was starting over. The church really protected me, loved me, and I built some amazing friendships. And I knew that my life had to change in dramatic ways if I was to stay faithful and not go back to homosexuality. I needed to start living my life on purpose and establish some self-imposed boundaries. There were certain places I just couldn't go back to, activities that I could never allow myself to participate in again. I was also finally honest with my struggles and temptations with my old friend Mike. One of the most difficult costs to count in becoming a Christian was that I could never be romantically involved with another man. But I knew that I didn't want to spend my life alone. So how was that going to be possible if it had to be with a woman? I mean, I'd never even been attracted to a girl before. And when I dated Kathy years earlier, she's the one who broke up with me. But I couldn't get her out of my mind. If I was ever to have a partner in life, I knew she was the one. So I started praying daily. God, I know I don't deserve this, but please, God, keep Kathy for me, and I promise that I'll love her like no one else can. I prayed that prayer hundreds of times for over 2 years. Then one day, I finally opened my mouth.
We were at a singles retreat when Guy asked me out. And everything in me screamed, no, I can't do this again. In fact, to this day, I'm sure I said no. But he carried on as if I'd said yes. And so a little while later, we met for coffee, and we knew this time would be very different.
So soon we started dating again. And we loved going on long walks, sharing our dreams, going to ball games, hockey games, out for dinner, the movies. And of course, we both had this deep desire to follow Jesus. I mean, she'd become my best friend. Even though I knew I wasn't attracted to Kathy the way a heterosexually attracted man would be, I knew I loved her and couldn't imagine living my life without her. As our friendship escalated into engagement, I knew I had to tell her about my situation. It was a pretty scary moment. I was afraid, of course, that she would reject me, and who could blame her?
When Guy first told me about his past, I was sad. Sad that he had been lonely and that he'd carried this secret for so long. But then I felt betrayed, and I got angry, and I was fearful. What if he was marrying me as an experiment? What if we could never have a normal physical relationship? What if he had AIDS? And for me, the biggest one was, what if he decided down the road that he would rather be with a man? At that point, Guy had not acted out in over 2 years. So I had to ask myself, if he's this committed to righteousness, do I really care if he's attracted to men or if he's attracted to women, as long as he's being faithful to me? And that was the point I realized, I love this man and I can trust that he will continue to be a spiritual man.
We both decided then and there that we would refuse to allow my same-gender attractions to be something that would define our relationship. Our wedding day was incredible. I'll never forget standing there at the front of that church as she walked down the aisle. As the congregation stood and the music played, I thanked God then and there for answering my prayers. Now, I understand that many same-sex attracted Christian men and women will never want to marry, and I respect that choice. It's not for everyone, but for Guy Hammond, marrying Kathy was the greatest decision of my life.
I think a lot of times for us as Christians and in the church, whenever we talk about the issue of homosexuality, we can talk about it in the context of something to oppose. But I would like to suggest that when we talk about homosexuality, it's in the context of people. We're not talking about an issue, we're talking about human beings. The majority of gay people that you work with, go to school with, live in your communities or in your families are just regular folks. They want to go to work, they want to go to school, they want to contribute to their communities. They don't want to fight, they don't want to argue, they don't want to insult people. And so I think it would be helpful for us not to make assumptions and to judge people, because when we start looking at groups of people like an issue, it makes it into an us versus them situation. And there is no us versus them. Listen, we're all in need of Jesus. We're all in need of forgiveness. We're all in need of mercy, right? And so there's no us versus them. You know, one of the terms that we can often use, and I've heard this a lot, is this term, love the sinner, hate the sin. And I would like to put before you that on this particular issue of homosexuality, that is probably not the best line to use. Because when somebody in the gay community hears a Christian say, I love the sinner, but I hate the sin, the only thing they hear in that line is the word hate. A Christian comedian and author, Mark Laurie, here's what he says: how about love the sinner, hate your own sin? He says, I don't have time to hate your sin. There's too many of you. Hating my sin is a full-time job. How about you hate your sin, I'll hate my sin, and we'll just love one another. Right? That's probably a better way for us to be able to deal with this issue, isn't it? The Apostle Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 12. He actually says there, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Now he goes on there to say we should judge those inside the church, but it's interesting that Paul says, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Well, what does that word judge actually mean? Well, the word actually means to approve or disapprove. That's a really interesting statement there that the Apostle Paul makes. What business is it of mine to approve or disapprove of anything people in the world who aren't Christians do? I'd like to use sports as an analogy. Of course, I'm Canadian, and about the only thing we do in Canada when it comes to sports is play hockey, right? Now, we do have an NBA team, and they're, the Toronto Raptors, but, honestly, I don't understand it. Hockey is a much more difficult sport to play. I think you'd all agree with me, right? Wow. Okay, see, I knew there'd be some protesters here tonight. Okay. Did you know that actually basketball was invented by a Canadian? Did you guys know that? That's true. You're welcome. It's true. Did you know that a Canadian invented cable television? That's true too. I apologize. So, anyway, that's actually me sitting on the bench at the Air Canada Centre where the Toronto Maple Leafs play. But you know what? That's about as close as I'll ever get to playing professional hockey. Wouldn't it be weird and strange if the Toronto Maple Leafs started judging me for not playing? Like, let's say the next game they have coming up. At the end of the game, they're all looking around the dressing room, and one of the players on the Toronto Maple Leafs says, "Where's Guy?"
I mean, why isn't he here tonight? And the players go, yeah, I can't believe he's not here. I mean, if they started judging me and talking bad about me because I didn't play in that game, that would be a strange thing to do because I'm not on the team. I never signed a contract, and I can skate, but not good enough to play with them. And so that's weird to judge me for that. But let's say that they were actually desperate enough to want me to come and play, and they said, Guy, would you come and play for the Toronto Maple Leafs? I would say, sure. And see, they would give me a contract, and I would read the contract, and if I agreed to the terms and conditions, I would sign the contract. Now I'm on the team. And so if I didn't show up for the next practice or the next game, see, now they have the right to judge me. They have the right to look around the room and say, where is Guy? Because he signed the contract. You see, if you have a gay couple come to church, it might be easy to want to look over and judge and think, how can they live that way? But if they're visiting with us, listen, what we want to do is be able to give them the opportunity to read the contract. So let's study the Bible. Let's learn about what God has to say about this. And over a period of time, we would build relationship and do so with an open Bible. And if they came to a point in their lives where they decided they wanted to give their life over to Jesus, they would become Christians. See, now they're on the team, and Paul says, well, in that setting, yes, we do have the right to judge one another, to walk side by side with one another and help each other live successfully as Christians. But for us to do so with people who aren't Christians, listen, they never agreed to the biblical sexual ethic to begin with. Why would we expect them to? Seven years after marrying Kathy, I actually became a minister at that church in Toronto. And over the next 15 years, we got the incredible opportunity to serve and teach hundreds of men and women in churches across Canada. As we learned to counsel people from all walks of life, I was determined to be transparent and honest with them about the sins in my own life and the temptations that I faced. But the one thing I could never discuss was my homosexual past or that I was still attracted to men. Even though I hadn't acted out in over 2 decades, besides telling Kathy and a few trusted spiritual advisors, I was simply too embarrassed and ashamed to talk about it. And just the thought of talking about it brought about fear. Actually, dread is a better word. There was nothing that caused me more self-loathing and regret than the fact that I was attracted to men. I found it completely humiliating. I was in a mental prison. For years, I had this recording going off in my head that was just on repeat. And the message was, Guy, what's wrong with you that you can't change this? You're a loser. You're a failure. You're disgusting. You're dirty. And if people knew who you really were, they would never love you. As I look back, it was an incredibly lonely and exhausting way to live.
For the first 15 years of our marriage, we were happy, we had fun together, but it was obvious Guy was still filled with a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. I knew he was having struggles, but he would never talk to me about them. This was an area we just could not communicate. If I ever brought up the subject or asked how he was doing, he would sometimes shut down completely for days. It was as if he'd gone into a black hole or a cave.
I felt like I wasn't fulfilling my role as a man. I absolutely had joy in my life as a Christian, and our marriage was fulfilling, but I just couldn't seem to get past my same-sex attractions. It was just so difficult.
At one point, Guy came to me and said, I have something to tell you, and I think you need to be sitting down to hear it. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is it. This is the affair. This is the thing I didn't know about. He started the conversation by sharing with me that he was very discouraged because he had spent the first 15 years of our marriage trying to be heterosexually attracted. He had tried everything. He had studied things. He had prayed and prayed and prayed. He really was apologetic. He was afraid that I was discouraged, that I would be let down somehow, that he was not being the husband that he should be to me. And my response honestly was, what? That's what you've been trying to do? That's where all the guilt and the shame and the discouragement have come from. I had no idea. That had never entered my mind that you would ever be heterosexually attracted. And I don't care. I love you, and I've lived all these years knowing you're same-sex attracted, and it hasn't mattered.
After that talk, I decided that I would no longer allow my insecurities to hurt our relationship and to allow painful secrets to carry on. I even told her about how I was molested when I was 8. She was the first person I had ever told. I didn't realize it then, but as our communication deepened, my weakness was finally becoming my strength.
You know, it took me, as I said, 2 years to go to church to hear the message. 2 years of learning about God. 2 years of building relationships with Christians. For me to finally get to a place where I felt like I could be transparent and vulnerable enough to tell them who I really was. But it took 2 years. Thank goodness those Christians were patient enough to let me be there for 2 years, instead of putting on some time frame to say, well, if he doesn't have everything figured out in the first few weeks or the first couple of months, he's out of here. You see, my question is, can we be secure enough in our own faith as Christians to have people who are at different places along their spiritual journey worship with us and give them the time and space they need to be able to ask questions about the Bible and about sexuality and the different things that they're working through in life? A lot of these things aren't going to change in a matter of weeks or even months. Sometimes it's going to take years for people to make the changes they need to. You know, there is a difference between acceptance and approval. And a lot of times we think, well, if I accept these people, if I hang out with these people, if I spend time with these people, if we let these people in the church for a long period of time, that will just mean we're approving of things. But there is a difference between acceptance and approval. You see, the whole beauty about Jesus was that he was able to be around people and accept them even though he didn't approve of how they were living. I'm not suggesting we don't teach biblical truth. Let's be honest about the truth. Let us be honest when we don't have an answer. Let us be honest when the answer is not popular. But let us also radically serve and love and welcome anyone, even though we disagree.
One day in the summer of 2006, I got a call that changed the direction of my life forever. A fellow minister invited me to speak at a conference in the U.S. about homosexuality in the church. I was stunned. Did someone tell this guy about my past? Well, actually, no. He simply thought that because I was a Canadian, I would have an interesting perspective on the matter. The whole idea just terrified me, so I immediately refused. I had hidden for so many years, I was forced to ask myself, what exactly was I hiding from? So I used to be gay and was attracted to guys. So what? My wife loved me. I had good friends who loved me. Jesus loved me. Who cares what anyone else thought? I then began to think about all the other Christians who lived outside the heterosexual mainstream, who felt as lonely and as isolated as I did. I began to think of it as a calling to reach out to them, letting them know that they weren't alone. And over the next 24 hours, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I was in turmoil, battling my fears and insecurities. But I went from not being able to even speak about my predicament to contacting the organizer and telling them that I would accept his invitation. I'll never forget the night before the event. Tears just streaming down my face. I was petrified and excited, all at the same time. Was I really about to stand in front of a group of strangers and come out of the closet? The lesson I gave that day was strained. I stumbled and struggled to get the words out, but with the help of God, I did it. It was the most terrifying and exciting day of my life. Over the next 7 days, I called my mom and relatives and told them for the first time that I was same-sex attracted. One of them disowned me and refused to talk to me for over a year. It was challenging, but I knew I had to keep speaking. A few days later, we started strengthinweakness.org, an online ministry devoted to helping same-sex attracted Christians like myself. Its purpose wasn't to try to convert people from homosexual attractions to heterosexuality, but offer resources and an online community to help them not feel so alone. I thought, if I could just find 30 Christians to help, then the website would be worth running. But we actually found 30 in the first week. Not long after that, it went past 100, then 500. From there, the ministry just exploded. I mean, I couldn't keep up with the sheer volume of people from all parts of the world who were contacting me for help. This issue was much bigger than I ever imagined. And I finally realized that God had a plan for all of this brokenness and heartache that I had experienced. I now had a new mission in life.
And so we should be able to be in relationship with people, be hospitable with people, spend time with people with whom we don't approve, but of whom we absolutely will accept. This is not a stance that equals liberalism, that says you can live however you want, nor is it a stance that equals conservatism, that says you have to have everything figured out and live exactly how we think you should live before we'll let you in. It's just a posture that says we recognize that these realities are very complex and very difficult. And you're going to need time to figure these things out. I think when we live like this, we're going to be going much farther in our ability to be able to reach people. You know, the Apostle Paul gives us some tremendous examples throughout Scripture on this. The one I'd like to share with you actually here is in Acts chapter 17. You know, when Paul went to Athens, he wasn't planning on actually staying very long. He had to wait for Timothy and Silas to catch up. And so let me just read a portion here. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see the city was full of idols. I think it's important for us to recognize how Paul felt, because we feel the same thing when we look at our culture today. You see, when Paul saw the idols, he was greatly distressed. One version I read the other day said that his spirit was provoked within him. I know how you feel. When you turn on your television and you see a gay pride parade and there's a bunch of guys on there in their underwear and you look at that and you go, what on earth is happening to my country? What is happening around me? And it's easy for us to have our spirits become provoked within us. I have felt the same way at times too. But see, the Apostle Paul gives us a tremendous example of how we should respond when that occurs to us. Because in the very next verse it says, so he picketed and protested and yelled and screamed. No, actually, he didn't do that, because the next verse actually says, so he reasoned. How do you reason? Well, you tell me what you're thinking and I'll listen. And then I'll tell you what I'm thinking and hopefully you'll listen. He reasoned. He was able to be with people with whom he didn't agree. And he was willing to take time to talk with them. And as the story goes on, it tells us that some of these people called him a babbler. This guy's out of his mind. What is he talking about? He's a babbler. Forget this guy. Other people, though, as you go through the story, said, I've never heard that before. Really? I think I'd like to hear you some more on this issue. And then some of those became Christians. You know, on this whole issue of homosexuality in our world today, let's be honest. If we have hopes to bring these people to Jesus, it's a tough sell. And you know, talking about becoming a Christian, you know, really means that we're going to be talking a lot about self-denial and living lives of restraint, which are not really great advertisements for Christianity. I think if we can reason with people, if we can sit down and talk and hear them out and hear what they've experienced and try to understand the challenges that they've been through, if we can be compassionate and non-judgmental and say, I'm not going to rush to assumptions, I'm not going to rush to judgments about you, this is going to be a safe place for us to talk. Our church is going to be a safe place for you to be able to ask these kinds of questions, and we're willing to be patient. It could be months, it could be years, but that's okay while you do so. This will be a safe place. I mean, even if they decide to leave and they all say you're crazy and they call you a babbler, okay? Then let them call you a babbler, but then let them leave saying, you know, I didn't agree with those people there at that church in Denver, but wow. There was no group of people who were more loving, more compassionate, and more serving than them. You know, I didn't leave homosexuality at the time that I did because I believed it was so bad. I left homosexuality because somebody was able to prove to me with an open Bible how much better Jesus is.
After starting Strength and Weakness Ministries, several churches, faith-based groups, and schools asked me to come and speak on the issue of homosexuality. Every experience was unique, but I'll never forget the very first time someone invited me. It was in 2010 in New Jersey. A Christian group at Rutgers University had learned about my ministry and wanted me to give a 2-hour presentation at their college campus. I was so excited that I agreed without giving it any thought. Little did I know that news of my visit was about to go viral, and not in a good way. 1 week prior to the event, I found out that a gay rights group on campus had been proactively trying to shut it down, even ripping down the posters. Apparently, they assumed I was going to spew a message of hatred and bigotry. When I found out, I started feeling pretty anxious about the whole thing. When I arrived at the event, there were angry protesters everywhere. The Christian group that invited me only had about 30 members, but the 200-seat auditorium was completely packed. The tension was so thick that when I began to go around the room to introduce myself to people, many would even shake my hand or look at me. As I gave my presentation, to my surprise, the audience was very respectful, but I could sense that I really wasn't winning anyone over. And I'll never forget this one woman who sat in the front row. She spent the whole 2 hours just staring me down. I mean, if looks could kill. And by the time I had finished my talk, I could feel the tension growing, so I quickly thanked the audience and walked away from the podium. And just then, someone stood up and shouted, "We were told you'd be here till 9 o'clock, and it's only 8:30, and I have a question." I reluctantly turned around, went back to the podium, and answered her question. Then quickly, dozens of hands shot up. The room got louder. Some people started shouting. Some were booing. I could quickly see that I was losing control of the situation. So I just pointed at random to one of the hands at the back of the room. The woman stood up. She introduced herself as the president of the LGBT organization that had planned the protest.
Thanks for watching part 2 of Finding Guy. Now before you go on to part 3, the final part of the movie, I wanted to ask, if you believe in what Zach and I are doing on this YouTube channel, please consider supporting us at our Patreon page or at our website. If you want to invite Guy Hammond to come speak to your group, go to this link. And if you want to show this movie to your church, we have a church movie package available at this link.